All right. It's go time on these doors. So, here's the deal. The cabinet's coming along, the internals are all veneered, everything is joined together, and it's looking good. And now the focus shifts to making these doors, which may be the most intricate part of this entire process for a number of reasons. Firstly, very simply, the doors need to be 7/8 of an inch thick. 7/8 plywood and or MDF is a little difficult to come by. You can do it, but it's difficult to come by. So instead, what I'm gonna do for a number of reasons is laminate 3/4 inch material with 1/16 inch poplar veneer and edge band those in between the inner veneers, and then maybe edge band that and then lay the outer veneers. It's gonna be a multi-step process. It's gonna be overly complicated. And then to make things even more complicated, I'm gonna laminate, do a bent tapered lamination along the curved component of the door, which is gonna act as the handle and a rather nice accent in my opinion. So that is the plan. But before I can do any of that, I need to do two things. Number one, I need to prototype these doors just to make sure that the idea works visually with the cabinet as it is. So I'm gonna knock those out a 1/4 inch MDF, and then if it works, I'm gonna make some templates so that I can make the actual door components. Well, now I'm feeling much better about how those doors look in the real cabinet versus how they look in a 3-dimensional model in CAD in SketchUp. Now, you saw me use the Shaper Origin, and that was just to make quick work of it. I was able to take the SketchUp file, download it, upload it into the Shaper Studios, put that on tool, cut it out a 1/4 inch MDF. That took me 30, 40 minutes, and that's with filming too. So it was very quick work to get a prototype going. And then I can take those same files and I can make both the routing template for the actual door pieces and the bending form for the bent laminations component of it all. So it's all working to make my life a little bit faster and a little bit easier. Can you do it by hand? Of course you can do it by hand. I've done it by hand 100 times. It's just making the same 1/4 inch MDF template by hand using sanding forms and good technique on the bandsaw, etc., etc. It's not that big a deal. But if I can do it a little bit faster, I will. So that's that. Now that I feel good about how it looks in 3 dimensions, it's time for me to start focusing on laminating these components, putting some edge banding on here, laminating that 1/16 inch poplar, and getting these things to a point where they are going to be ready to press the veneers on. So let's get busy doing that. Man, I really gotta get better at this editing thing. Luckily, that's easy to do with the sponsor of this week's video, Skillshare.
Skillshare is the largest online community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry experts across design, photography, illustration, art. They even have woodworking classes. Skillshare can help you take your career, passions, or side hustles to the next level. You know, as woodworkers, I think we often struggle with the design process. We see ourselves as craftspeople rather than designers or artists. But one of the skills I've found most useful in my career is developing a basic understanding of drawing. It can be difficult to express an idea to a client, and sometimes it's even difficult to figure out what's in my own head. I sought out professional drawing classes years ago to help me develop those skills, but these days, Skillshare not only has classes available, they have an entire learning path dedicated to it. 7 sequential classes that will take you from absolute basics all the way to advanced shading techniques, which will help you better express your ideas on paper. And paper is a whole lot cheaper than wood. So if you want to improve your drawing skills, master video editing, or simply engage with the sponsors of this channel so that I can continue to bring you free videos, then click the link in the description below. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so go get started today. All right, I currently have no idea where I'm at. So here's the truth. Here's the actual reality of being a furniture maker full-time. You never just build furniture. You do a million things. And for the last week, I was away teaching. So I've been out of the shop for 8 days now, and I need to wrap my mind back around where I am in this process because I left very much mid-process. So let's work through this together. Let's figure out where I'm at and what my next steps need to be. I know, obviously, that I've edge banded 3 sides of these doors. And you may be saying 2 things. Number 1, Eric, those are some wide edge bandings. And they are. They are going to get trimmed twice. I'm about to laminate this poplar on here on both sides to beef this up from 3/4 to 7/8. And then I'll trim that down a little past final size and then add on my final edge banding before I veneer the final faces on. So it's a multi-step sandwich that's going on right here. So that then clearly is my next step. Now you may also be saying, why didn't you edge band the 4th side? One side is left unbanded, and that's a fair question. That side is going to be where I cut that big sweeping curve to attach the bent laminations that become the handle. And that's kind of the whole visual focal point of this piece from a design perspective. So there's no reason to edge band that because it's going to get effectively banded with the handle itself. So okay, all right, so I know where I'm at now. I've got to laminate these in the bag press, trim it down, re-edge band it, final veneers, and then in the meantime I can start working on those curved components. So let's go do that. So let's first dive into the question of why I'm using this thick poplar veneer to face the MDF before putting my final face veneers on. Well, first and foremost, I just hate 3/4 of an inch. I think it's ubiquitous, I think it's utilitarian, and I hate the way that it looks, and I try to avoid it at all costs. But I recognize that's just me being an elitist, so take that or leave it, that's up to you. The other more functional reason I'm doing this is because this piece is going to go down to Florida. And the humidity differential between Philadelphia and Florida is pretty substantial. And MDF can do weird things. You can't really predict the way that it's going to move, especially if one face is on the outside of the cabinet and the other face is on the inside. weird things happen, and I don't want the client calling me in 6 months and saying, hey, these doors are all effed and you need to come and fix them. So what I'm attempting to do here is to essentially create an MDF core plywood. Now, before you go typing up in those comments, I know it's not a plywood. It is just a thick face veneer with another glue lamination, but those glue laminations do lock this thing in place and give it some structural rigidity that pure MDF doesn't. Will you get that same rigidity using just face veneers because you're adding 2 glue seams? To some extent, yes, but you're limiting even more how these things can move and groove, and you're creating yet another glue seam by adding that thick face poplar on there. So that's what I'm doing, you know? I mean, listen, everything's an experiment, right? So we're gonna see if it works. I believe that it will, but we're gonna find out. Now, once I've got my poplar faces on there and before I can put my final face veneer on, I need to do my final edge banding. On the outside of the cabinet, I used the same veneers to just simply wrap around the edge, but I'm not going to do that here because, well, I just don't want to. So I have this curly maple lying around. I think it will play really nicely with this Kalo birch veneer. So I'm gonna put it on there, and listen, worst case scenario, if it doesn't look the way I want it to, I can always veneer over it. But I think it'll play well. I think it'll give it a little bit of that, you know, that je ne sais quoi, if I can continue to be an elitist and use a French term. But I do think it will balance nicely. And, you know, there's only one way to find out. So let's do that. And so with everything looking good and flush and trim and flat, my edge banding mitered and clean, it's finally time to press these face veneers, put some glue on this substrate, and get them in the bag.
All right, before I press this final panel, I want to show you guys exactly how I built out this edge trimming layer situation and give you an idea of why I took the steps I did. So let's dive into that. So the way I've constructed these panels are MDF core with an edge banding that's nice and beefy because I am going to have to attach hinges and screws to this piece, and you can't screw into MDF very successfully. So that's gonna give me plenty of registration for any of the screws on the hinge side of this cabinet. Then I applied the 1/16 poplar veneer, which beefed up this 3/4 inch MDF to 7/8 of an inch thick. 1/16 on either side is gonna beef that up by 1/8. So that creates a really structurally sound sandwich where the edge banding is glued onto the MDF and then it's sandwiched between 2 more glue layers, which makes this super stable. Then I've attached my final edge banding out here, which is only 1/4 of an inch thick, and then I will put my final face veneer on top of here, creating yet another sandwich. Now the last thing I want to mention before I put this panel in the bag is the use of Bondo in a wood shop. I know, I can smell the hate coming.
I'm an idiot! You're an idiot!
But sometimes when you have a substrate like this, there's going to be imperfections in it. In this case, there's just a couple of dings and dents or a little bit of tear out from where I pulled the blue tape off of, or like there was on this panel, sometimes a veneer tapers out, and when you go to butt seam it, there's just going to be a little step there, and those steps can transfer to the face veneer because those face veneers are not very thick at all. So how do you deal with that? In this case, you just mix up a little Bondo, putty it up, sand it down, make it flat and smooth so that the veneer can adhere to that sub panel without any dings or dents under it. That is how I chose to deal with it. Can you fill that in other ways? Of course you can. Could you cut it out and redo it? Yeah, but that's a lot of work. Could you fill it with just a typical wood filler? Sure. But in this case, using Bondo is just a quick and easy way for me to make sure that this surface is perfectly flat and smooth. So yes, I did use it. I want to acknowledge that it has its place in the wood shop. The haters gonna hate, so let's get this thing pressed.
All right, I want to address a question that kind of has nothing to do with this video, but absolutely does because it has everything to do with this project. And that is, do you size your components to your veneer or do you size your veneer to your components? And what I mean by that is, do you design the object and then search for the veneers to fit the object? Or do you find the veneers that you want to use and then base your object around those veneers? And look, for me, the answer is yes. It's always a form and function. It's never either or. You design with an idea in mind, with a visual in mind, and then you find the veneers that best fit that visual. And sometimes that means the veneers that you have or that you find that will work aren't exactly the right size. So you adjust a little bit here and there. And in this case, my object wanted to be 24 wide. The veneers that I found were 23 wide, but they worked so well that I adjusted the object to fit. And that's an okay thing to do. I think sometimes, especially early on, we just get caught up in this idea of it has to be this one thing. And guys, it's an art. It's flexible. Do what you gotta do.
Okay. Do you ever come in on a Monday morning and just know it's gonna be one of those days? Noise in the hallway, upstairs music's blaring, outside there's been a truck making noise for 30 minutes, and I may have just lost a package of veneers. You know? It is what it is some days. But here's the plan. Before I left, I got all of these laminations cut to make my door handle, the curved component of this thing. So I need to do a couple of things. Number one, I need to taper all of these down. So I need to make a tapering jig. Number two, I then need to make a bending form so that I can laminate these components together and create that arched piece. So how am I gonna do that? That's such a great question. I'm so glad you asked. I'm going to make the tapering form very simply, old school. I'm just gonna make my measurements. I'm gonna cut that out of MDF, and then I'm gonna be able to taper these. My bending form, usually I make a 1-part bending form because I'm too lazy to make a 2-part bending form, but I'm gonna try a different thing today, and we're gonna see how it goes. So let's dive into that. Okay, let's pause briefly to discuss forms, making forms, and why I said earlier I don't typically make 2-part forms. I'm at a good pause point right now to give you a visual representation of the issue here, so let's touch on that. So when you make a bending form, you typically make a single arc, and then you'll clamp your laminations on using a clamping caul of some kind, something to spread the clamping pressure out and to take whatever form the exterior of that curve is. Because you may or may not know this from 8th grade geometry, the interior of this curve and the exterior of this curve are different radii. The interior of a circle plus the thickness of your material that you're laminating is going to create a different radius on the outside of that circle. So if I were to make a 2-part form, I would have to figure out what both radii are and make 2 very accurate forms. But if I make a single form and then just pad it out with clamping cauls, it doesn't matter what that exterior radius is. Now this issue compounds here because I've got my interior curve, which is not just part of a circle. It's not a perfect arc. It is an oblong, part of an ellipse. I don't know how to describe it, but it's not purely circular. And it's tapered, meaning that that same shape is at an angle to the other one. It's thinner up here than it is down here. So there's a lot of moving parts here. And if I were to try to make a 2-part form by hand, it would require a lot of math that I'm not willing to do. However, using the shaper origin, I can map that out because I had my components made in SketchUp. I can map that out directly on this piece, and all I have to do is essentially cut the negative of the laminations away, and I have my 2-part form made. Now, downsides to this approach. This is all in theory. The math and the reality can be, and often are, especially in my work, 2 different things. So if I say it wants to be 1 1/4 inches down here, and it ends up being 1 3/16 inches, that's going to throw my jig off, so I'm going to have to machine very accurately, or I'm going to have to adjust this jig after the fact. But for right now, I'm going to try to make this two-part form. If nothing else, I can always just get rid of the top part and use the bottom part. Now, another benefit to using the origin in this circumstance is I can mark exactly where both my component is supposed to start and end, and where my laminations should, in theory, start and end. And the reason that matters is, again, because this is tapered, and these are doors, everything's machined pretty accurately, and it needs to be a tight fit. If the thickness of my component at the beefiest part, where the two doors touch at the bottom, is off, if that's too skinny, that's going to be a real issue. And my arc has to match my door, so that's going to be an issue. So if this whole thing, if my laminations get shifted down towards the beefier end, that's going to mean that the laminations are a little bit thinner where the bottom of the component and the curve actually sits. So my alignment needs to be really strong on this piece. Typically, I just do that with a pencil mark. That'll get the job done. But because I was doing it with the origin, I did have the opportunity to give myself perfect lines so that it's a little bit more accurate than just slapping a slash on there with a pencil. Necessary? No. Beneficial? Absolutely. So I'm going to keep going with this. I'm going to make this form now and then cut it out, and then I can rough cut my other piece, template route that, and get a perfect form that should, in theory, be a good two-part form. Then we'll taper the laminations and we'll make sure that everything fits together. So, here's the deal about how this jig and or clamping fixture came together. The two-part worked beautifully. It is very, very close to the dimensions that I had planned. I'm off by like a 1/28 or something like that. So, basically what that means is, what I figured out, I should say, is if I clamp it in the middle first and get out any of that little gap that's existing in there and then spread the clamps outward, I've got a beautiful clamping surface all the way down. No need to pad out either A or B of this clamping fixture. Now, you may be asking, what the hell are these two things doing over here? That's a great question. I'm so glad you asked. Essentially, what that is doing is locating the top of this two-part form where it needs to be in relation to the lower part. All four stems or legs are inside the outer part, so that doesn't allow it to shift left or right in any way. And then also, once I get the laminations in there, I can just drop it on and clamp it, and I don't have to worry about it shifting one way or the other during the actual clamping process. So that all said, I've got this taped out, I got these bits waxed up, and I think it's time to actually do a proper glue up now. You know, I'm over here recording for like a good 90 seconds, and then she just decides to make noise right at the very end. Yep. Hey. Yeah. Oh, dude. Is it bad?
I didn't look at it yet.
Okay. Let me.
But it felt really bad.
Okay. Let me. I've got glue on this. As soon as I get a clamp on here, I will take a look. Are you feeling okay? You need to sit down? You sure? Well, that worked swimmingly, didn't it? Well, that worked absolutely perfectly. It's absolutely lovely. So I'm going to get the other one glued up in clamps, and then I can clean this up. Tomorrow I can process both pieces, and in the meantime I can make my router template for the door panel itself now that I have one, because I can make sure that my router template fits the inside of this curve perfectly, and I can do any adjustments I need to do. It should, in theory, fit right off of the shaper origin as I took this same curve there. But if there is any differential in this, I can now fit it to this piece. And that way, tomorrow, once the next one is out of clamps, I can actually think about how I'm gonna get these attached to the doors. So, let's do that. Well, that is where I'm going to have to leave it. A little anticlimactic, I know. However, before I go, a couple of things. First and foremost, when I'm attaching, a little tidbit for you, when I'm attaching hardwood or solid wood to a veneered surface, sometimes what I'll do is I'll actually put a little bit of blue tape on the underside of my domino. And what that allows me to do, assuming I'm using the underside as my registration point, like I did here, what that allows me to do is raise the domino up by the thickness of a piece of tape on one component, the solid wood component, which then forces it to sit down by around the thickness of a piece of tape, which is not perfect, but just a little bit below the surface, or above the surface, depending on what orientation it's in, of the veneered surface. So when I go to sand this down or smooth that section out, I'm not risking burning through the veneer to try to sand anything down. Heaven forbid this solid piece be below the veneered surface. So that's just a little thing that I do sometimes to make sure I have a little bit of insurance there. I'm more happy to remove the thickness of a piece of tape off the solid wood surface than I am risking burning through the veneer that I've just spent, whatever it's been, 4 or 5 days working on these doors. So that's how I went about doing that, to give that some positive registration there. Now also, just on the excess that's here, I have to leave these long. I can't glue them on just yet because I haven't glued up the cabinet. I got to fit the cabinet doors to the thing. And there's a lot of steps in between what's happening right now and where the cabinet needs to end up before I can fit the doors. So for right now, they're just going to be leftover length. As I was looking at them, I thought that could be a really cool design feature if those laminations went through the top and bottom of the cabinet. I don't think that that is an opportunity for this particular piece. I don't think it fits with the overall composition, but it is one of those moments of that's the design process in action, and as I'm seeing it and thinking about it, I'm going to log that away in the back of my brain and maybe apply that in a future piece. It could make for a really interesting thing. So
Just a thing of note there. That all being said, I've got a lot of work to do now. I've got to think about the back panels. I got to start stitching up the top. So I'm going to go get to doing that, friends. I hope this was helpful. I hope it was entertaining. And I hope you'll join me for the next one. I don't have my coffee mug right now, but I will cheers you regardless. So see you in the next video. Cheers.